How's it going, everybody? My name is Dan Longton, and welcome to LongtinArt. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding value a little bit further than that first assignment that we did as a gradation step value challenge. Today, we're actually going to talk about one of the types of underpaintings, and it's called a grisaille. The root word is actually French, and it comes from grise or gray, meaning that typically the entire or most of the subject matter is done in a bluish neutral gray or a variance of neutral grays throughout the entire subject. Now, it could be a still life. Most of the time it's used in portrait painting. You definitely probably don't want to do this in a landscape just because of the textures that are involved, but you absolutely can use it wherever you want. So the first thing that I want to talk about is when dealing with grisailles. Now, why on earth would you do this? Okay, well, there's a couple of things of why you would use a grisaille in your underpainting process. Now, this is one of the underpaintings that I'm actually going to study and do studies on, I should say. And one of the reasons why I start with my Painting 1 students in college to do a grisaille is because, one, they just did a value step study and a blending study of those 11-step values based off of the Munsell scale. Neutral grays, and once they have that understanding and they can produce those 11-step values, it's very easy to then apply those values to an image. Now, I'm going to show you my process and how I did it, and hopefully that'll help, but the grisaille is really a wonderful way to start just because you don't have to worry about color. You know, color is a whole different can of worms, and we're going to talk about color in another video in part 2 of this because we are going to colorize this image, but getting the rendering down first when dealing with just neutral grays is a wonderful way to start to learn to paint because it does give you the brush miles and the experience and dexterity of pushing the paint around, but it also gives you experience on the palette and how to mix paints together. It's a limited palette of only black and white, but nonetheless, it is experience. But it allows you to relax in the studio a little bit more. And to me, honestly, this is a great way to work because what we're eventually going to do is glaze over this with transparent colors. And that allows the painting to have a luminous effect because the light goes through the transparent layers of color, hits the grisaille, and reflects back through the color. So it takes on this kind of luminous glow from within. It's a very beautiful process. I love painting still life in this method. I've kind of always done my method, my still lifes in this particular method. I use a bistre for my landscapes, and I've always done it that way. But these underpainting techniques have been around for centuries, and the old masters have used it, and there's so much to learn from it. So let me show you what I did in my process. So the first image I'm going to show you is a image of, it's going to be a little bit dark, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So on the bottom, you can see my camera. I've got it in a landscape orientation. This was a shot that I didn't want to do. I eventually scrapped the yellow bell pepper for an orange one, but you can see that I've got it in a portrait orientation, which I did change to a horizontal orientation. But you can see that the light source, which it's kind of hard to see because I blacked out my studio and I wanted to control any bounce light. I didn't want any additional highlights on my still life, so I really did black out my studio. I put some blankets over the windows. I set up my strobe, which is an Alien Bee, wonderful product. I'll put it on my website if you're interested in it. They're not that expensive. $250 gets you a great strobe, and you just have to connect with the hot shoe. Wonderful, wonderful light. But you can see what I'm set up. So I eventually, like I said, I scrapped the idea of the yellow just because the yellow in the cutting board, the yellow bell pepper in the cutting board, they seem to clash a little bit too much. So I went with a deeper orange-red type of setup. And I eventually, ended up doing a orange bell pepper, which in my opinion, the contrast quite nice with the orange and the black. I love Halloween anyway, but yeah. So the green stem and the orange, this is somewhat of an analogous color scheme if you look at a color wheel. The orange is right next to yellow, which is also part of green. So green, orange, yellow would be your three colors or hues that are next to one another on the color wheel. So I thought that was a good combination. So I went ahead and went with the orange and keeping that warm cutting board on the bottom. Obviously, the light source is coming from the upper left, which produces that nice, hot, warm highlight on the bell pepper. From there, I took the image into Photoshop and desaturated the image. But I also took it a step further because I'm using the Munsell scale. And if you're not familiar with the Munsell scale, this is something that you should look up. Munsell changed the way that we think of color in the sense that, in a traditional color wheel, this is what we all grew up learning. And it's not exactly an accurate representation of color because it's only two-dimensional. You have your primaries, which are red, yellow, and blue. With two primaries mixed becomes a secondary, which is your orange, green, and violet. And then your tertiaries are in between the primaries and secondaries. By mixing a primary and a secondary gets you tertiary colors like red, violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red, orange. Okay, this is what we grew up learning. And it's not exactly a correct representation of color because the Munsell system, in the center of the color system that Munsell has created, is your 10-step value. From 0 meaning black, from 10 to white. 10 being white, 0 meaning black. And your hue, which is that ring, also known as the color, is your Roy G. Biv spectrum. So you have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. You have your violet, your red violets, your primary, secondary, and tertiary colors of what I just said. Okay? And then from there, you also have chroma. And chroma is the intensity or saturation of that color. And when you think about color, it's kind of hard not to talk about the rainbow because we perceive color with our eyes, and light is a little bit different than color. Light works off of an RGB color wheel as opposed to a red, yellow, and blue color wheel. When you're mixing paint, it is a subtractive process, meaning the more paint you mix together, the duller the chroma gets. So if you take blue and yellow, both very, very intense colors, and you mix those together to make a green, the green is not going to be as saturated in chroma value as the blue or the yellow because you mix those two together, the chroma is going to drop. It's still going to be an intense green, but it's not as intense as the original colors were. Now, when you talk about light and you talk about an additive process of color mixing, when you take red, green, and blue, which is the color wheel of light, the more you mix, the more intense the color becomes. Because if you take a traditional color wheel of red, yellow, and blue of paint and mix them together, you're going to get a gray or a mud. It's going to drop down in saturation, and you're usually going to end up with a mud. If you take all of the colors of a red, green, and blue light color wheel, dealing with like light spectrum, the spectral light of nanometers, the more color you add, the more intense the color gets. So when you mix all of red, green, and blue together in light, you get white light as opposed to a mud in traditional color mixing. So when you're dealing with grisailles, you're not thinking of chroma and you're not thinking of hue. You're only dealing with the grays. So it makes it a really easy way to think about things. So back over to the image. I set this guy up so that I would get a desaturated image of my still life, which is just a bell pepper. And from that, I started to make my drawing. I did not record the drawing session just because I wanted to speed the video up, but there's a lot to talk about when dealing with value and grisaille. So I'm going to do this in a two-part session. I'm going to introduce my setup, which is my drawing here, my palette, which is also based off of the Munsell system. I believe that I did 10 steps to my color. There's also a really, really wonderful way that Gamblin has to create your Munsell scale. Gamblin has a line of paint called Portland Gray, and it has 3 levels. It has Portland Gray Deep, Portland Gray Medium, and Portland Gray Light. And Portland Gray Light is 3 steps down from white in terms of the Munsell scale, which it makes things easier so you don't have to mix everything up. So if you were thinking of white as number 10, Portland Gray would be number 8. Portland Gray Medium would be a number 6. Portland Gray Deep would be a number 4. And then if you really wanted to keep it in a neutral black, I believe it's Mars Black that is recommended for Portland Gray, as you would use for a black. And from the black and the Portland Gray Deep, you could then mix up your values 1, 2, and 3, giving you a 10 value spectrum, okay, which is kind of what I have here. So once you have your image drawn out, which I'm going to make a video on how to grid your drawing and enlarge your drawings just so that you can use your reference photo and transfer this information over. If you have a projector, use a projector. If you want to use the grid system, use the grid system. And something like this, you want as detailed of a drawing as possible anyway. It really doesn't matter. You're going to cover it up. It doesn't matter how you get your drawing down. I don't know what people are saying about, projectors these days. NASA used a slide rule to go to the moon. It's okay to use a calculator now. So use whatever tools you have. I'm sure the old masters would say that if you look at a camera obscura and a projector today. So use whatever tools you have, because it's about the process, not the product, in my opinion. So if you enjoy using it, if you want to get right down into the, drawing it out, use a projector. If you like using the grid system, it's a little bit slower. I typically use my grid system every time I do a landscape. But, just do what makes it, what feels right for you and what's easier for you. But once you get your drawing and you get your 10-step values, break your image down to a black and white, and from there we can start painting. So let's get to it.